A mother sits down to write a children's book about losing a parent. She says it's for her 3 sons, so they can process their father's sudden death. Bookstores carry it. Local news puts her on air to talk about it. And viewers see a grieving widow finding a way to turn tragedy into something useful. 2 months after that television appearance, she's in handcuffs, charged with his murder. The autopsy found roughly 5 times a lethal dose of fentanyl in her husband's blood. Prosecutors would later argue this wasn't even the first time she'd tried. In 2026, a jury needed just 3 hours to convict her on every single count against her. This is the story of Kouri Richins, the woman who published a book about grief while she was still the reason anyone had one to write about. Kouri and Eric Richins raised their 3 young sons in Camas, a quiet mountain town roughly 40 miles outside Salt Lake City. From the outside, the family looked settled, even enviable. Eric ran his own construction business. Kouri flipped houses. Neighbors remembered them as the kind of couple who showed up to every school event, every holiday gathering, every community function, present, sociable, seemingly fine. They'd built a life that, from a distance, resembled the American dream. 3 healthy boys, a growing property portfolio, a beautiful part of the state to call home. Underneath that surface, things were far less stable. The 2 of them were carrying close to $7.5 million in debt tied to their real estate ventures. The sort of financial strain that rarely shows up in a family photo, and even more rarely gets discussed at a school pickup line. That pressure had worn the marriage down over time, and something darker had begun creeping in alongside it, something neither of them was talking about openly with the people around them. In the months leading up to his death, Eric grew suspicious of his own wife. According to people close to him, he told relatives directly that he believed Kouri might be trying to poison him, and that if anything ever happened to him, they should look at her first. It's a haunting thing to learn after the fact. A man essentially leaving behind a warning, months before that warning turned out to be exactly right. On the evening of March 3rd, 2022, the couple stayed in to celebrate. Kouri had just closed a property sale for her business, and by her own account, they marked the occasion with drinks at home. She told police she mixed Eric a Moscow Mule in the kitchen and carried it up to their bedroom, where he sipped it while eating a THC gummy. Later that night, one of their sons woke up from a nightmare. Kouri went to comfort him, and rather than returning to her own room afterward, she said she stayed and fell asleep beside the boy. At 3:21 the following morning, she dialed 911. She told the dispatcher she'd gone to check on her husband and found him cold to the touch, unresponsive, at the foot of their bed. Paramedics rushed to the house, but there was nothing left to save. Eric was pronounced dead at the scene at 4:58 a.m. A 39-year-old father of 3, gone with no obvious explanation for why. What unfolded in the days and months afterward raised quiet eyebrows long before any arrest was made. The very next day, while grief should still have been raw, Kouri went ahead with the celebration party they'd originally planned for the property sale. Some who knew her chalked it up to shock, an unusual coping mechanism from someone who simply didn't know how else to move forward. Others, once more details surfaced, saw it differently. A woman who never seemed to slow down, even for a moment, at the exact time everyone around her expected her to fall apart. A year later, in March 2023, she took things much further. She published a children's book titled Are You With Me? A story following a young boy learning to cope with the loss of his father, dedicated to her own sons. She didn't publish it quietly, either. She sat down for a friendly, on-camera interview with a local Utah lifestyle program and explained that she'd written it to help her boys process their father's unexpected passing. The segment aired to an audience with no reason to doubt a word of it. To viewers watching that broadcast, she looked like a widow turning tragedy into something meaningful, a mother finding purpose in loss. Behind the scenes, Detectives had already spent the better part of a year quietly assembling a case that would make that same interview almost unwatchable in hindsight, once the full picture eventually came out. Here's the single detail that transformed this from an unexplained overdose into a full homicide investigation. Before he died, Eric had told people close to him that he suspected his own wife was trying to poison him, and that if something ever happened to him, authorities should start with her. On its own, a statement like that might sound like paranoia or the kind of thing said in the heat of marital tension. In hindsight, it reads like a man trying to leave breadcrumbs behind, in case he wasn't around to explain things himself. That single statement became the roadmap for everything that followed. Once detectives had a name and a plausible motive worth exploring, they began pulling apart every financial record, every digital search, and every purchase Kouri had made in the months leading up to her husband's death, building a timeline out of receipts, browser history, and bank statements that no one had thought to hide particularly well. What surfaced was extensive. Weeks before Eric died, Kouri had purchased fentanyl pills, telling the seller, per court documents, that they were meant for an investor dealing with chronic back pain. Detectives also found internet searches on her devices about poison, and separately, about how life insurance payouts actually worked. About a month before Eric's death, she'd taken out an additional $100,000 policy on his life, forging his signature on the paperwork and naming herself the sole beneficiary, according to prosecutors. But the most chilling piece of the entire timeline wasn't even the night Eric actually died. It was something the case file describes happening weeks earlier, on a day that's supposed to represent the opposite of what occurred. Per the charges, Kouri had already tried to poison Eric once before, on Valentine's Day, weeks ahead of his eventual death. That first attempt didn't work. Eric survived it, apparently without fully grasping how close he'd come. And when that initial dose proved too weak to finish what prosecutors say she'd started, she went back to her supplier asking for something stronger. A few weeks later, on an otherwise unremarkable Friday night, Eric was dead. Detectives identified a housekeeper who worked for the family as a key link in obtaining and delivering the fentanyl that ultimately killed him. Court filings describe this as more than a single transaction, part of an ongoing arrangement stretching back weeks before his death. Underneath all of it sat money, a staggering amount of it, more than most people accumulate in a lifetime, let alone find themselves buried under. A financial expert who later testified at trial laid out just how deep the hole really was. Roughly $7.5 million in outstanding debt from their real estate ventures, hidden beneath a lifestyle that looked, from the outside, entirely comfortable. When Kouri received a payout from one of Eric's life insurance policies, records showed the funds didn't go towards starting fresh with her children or toward any kind of new beginning. They went almost entirely toward chipping away at that debt. Within months, her account balance had dropped back down to a few $100s. The windfall, completely absorbed by the very pressure investigators believe helped drive the murder to begin with, gone almost as fast as it arrived. Detectives also uncovered an extramarital relationship, adding one more thread to a motive that stretched well beyond grief, and making the image of a devoted, heartbroken widow harder and harder to reconcile with the mounting evidence. Something else turned up buried inside Eric's toxicology report that received far less early attention than the fentanyl itself. Trace amounts of an antipsychotic medication that appeared to belong to Kouri, not to him. It was a small footnote in a case already crowded with bigger revelations, but it reinforced a pattern investigators had grown increasingly confident about, that whatever ended up in Eric's system that night hadn't arrived there by chance, and probably wasn't the first substance to have found its way in. By May of 2023, more than a year after Eric's death, and while Kouri was still on local television promoting a book about coping with losing him, investigators finally had enough to act. She was arrested and charged with aggravated murder, attempted aggravated murder, insurance fraud, and forgery. Quick pause before we get into the arrest, because this is exactly the kind of case this channel exists for. If a stranger's warning about their own spouse turning out to be true doesn't unsettle you a little, wait until you hear what the phone records show later on. Tap subscribe now so the next one lands in your feed automatically, because this story only gets stranger from here. Roughly a year into her time behind bars, Kouri broke her public silence in a jailhouse interview, describing herself as an innocent mother torn away from her children by the media and the case against her. She pleaded not guilty to every charge she faced. Kouri Richins' trial finally began in February 2026 in Park City, Utah, nearly 4 years after her husband's death and almost 3 years after her arrest. Getting there hadn't been simple. Her defense repeatedly tried to move the trial out of Summit County entirely, arguing the local population had been saturated with coverage for years and couldn't produce an unbiased jury. Judges rejected that request every single time it was filed, ruling that enough impartial jurors could still be found through careful screening. Even jury selection took real effort. This was a case the community had followed obsessively, fueled by national coverage from outlets like Dateline and 48 Hours, and finding jurors without a pre-existing opinion proved genuinely difficult in a town this size. Once proceedings finally got underway, the prosecution called more than 40 witnesses across 3 weeks of testimony, an unusually large number for a case resting almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. They walked jurors through the couple's collapsing finances, the affair, the secretly forged policy, and, most damaging of all, testimony tying Kouri directly to the source of the fentanyl. The most consequential witness came early, a former chief medical examiner, who told the jury flatly that Eric hadn't administered that fatal dose to himself. Someone else had given it to him, deliberately, in his professional opinion. It set the tone for everything that followed. This wasn't a case about whether a crime happened, but about who committed it. Then came the phone call. Prosecutors played a recorded conversation between Kouri and a doctor, right there in open court, letting jurors hear her own voice instead of a summary of it. It's one thing to read about a phone call in a case file. It's another to sit 12 feet away and listen to it happen. A man who'd been dealing drugs around the time of Eric's death took the stand next and admitted, under oath, that he'd sold pills connected to the case. Not a rumor, not a second-hand account, someone with first-hand knowledge of where the fentanyl came from. The final thread came from an associate connected to the family's housekeeper, who walked the jury through exactly how the drugs allegedly moved from a supplier into the Richins household in the weeks before Eric died, closing the loop between Kouri had access, and here's precisely how. Beyond those 4, dozens of other witnesses filled in the rest of the picture. The state of the marriage, the mounting debt, the affair, the paperwork behind the forged policy. None of them alone would have been enough. Together, they built a wall of circumstance the defense never fully found a way around. Notably, the state never claimed it could prove the exact mechanics of how that final, fatal dose was delivered on the night Eric died. It didn't need to. Between the earlier attempt, the searches, the forged signature, and the financial desperation underlying everything, the weight of circumstance alone proved enough. On March 16, 2026, after only 3 hours of deliberation, remarkably fast for a trial that had run 3 weeks, the jury returned guilty verdicts on every single charge: aggravated murder, attempted aggravated murder, 2 counts of insurance fraud, and forgery. The author of a book about grief was now, officially, a convicted killer. Before the sentencing, and what her own kids said in that courtroom is genuinely hard to hear. I want to know where you landed. Type guilty or not enough evidence below, based only on what you've heard so far. I'll be checking the comments to see if this one splits the room or not. Kouri Richins' sentencing hearing landed on May 13, 2026, Eric's birthday, and it became one of the heaviest moments the case had produced yet. The room carried a different weight than the trial itself. This wasn't about establishing what happened anymore. It was about hearing directly from the people left behind. Statements from the couple's 3 young sons were read aloud in court by therapists, since the boys themselves weren't present. Each child described the same underlying fear in their own words, that they wouldn't feel safe in the world if their mother were ever released from prison. One statement, read on behalf of the couple's middle son, put it about as plainly as a child possibly could, that she had taken everything from him, and that he wouldn't feel safe again if she got out. Kouri addressed the court herself for roughly 30 minutes, speaking directly to her children even though they weren't there to hear it in person. She maintained her innocence for the entirety of that statement, telling them the idea that she'd taken their father from them was, in her own words, an absolute lie, and that it felt just as absurd to her that day as it had 4 years earlier, back when Eric first died. She told them that whenever they were ready to talk to her again, she'd be waiting. None of it changed the outcome. Judge Richard Mrazek handed down the maximum sentence available: life in prison without the possibility of parole on the aggravated murder charge, plus additional consecutive terms for attempted murder, insurance fraud, and forgery. Both the prosecution and the judge were blunt about their reasoning. Someone convicted of killing and previously attempting to kill her own husband and the father of her children was simply too dangerous to ever be free again. This hasn't closed the book on the case, though. Kouri's team has filed a formal appeal of her conviction, bringing in an entirely new set of attorneys separate from the ones who represented her at trial. A shift some legal commentators read as a sign that even her own defense believed a different strategy might be needed going forward. In the months since, she's already tried, and failed, to get her original trial judge removed from the case, arguing in a formal filing that he'd shown favoritism toward the prosecution throughout the proceedings. A different Utah judge reviewed that claim directly and rejected it outright, finding no supporting evidence and noting the filing hadn't even followed the correct legal process under state law. A separate request for an entirely new trial was denied as well, closing off one of her most direct paths back to freedom, at least for now. She's currently serving her sentence at a Utah correctional facility, with no possibility of parole under the terms handed down at sentencing. Her appeal is still working its way through the courts, and cases of this size and complexity can often take years to resolve, meaning the legal chapter of this story, unlike the trial itself, is far from finished. She maintains her innocence to this day. Even at sentencing, with a life term already effectively locked in, she told the courtroom she intended to keep fighting the conviction no matter how long it takes. Here's what stays with me about this one. It isn't the poison or the forged policy or even the affair. It's the timeline. A book about coping with grief, promoted on camera to an audience who had no idea, published by someone who was still a full year away from being arrested for causing that grief herself. Life without parole, justice served. Or is there still a piece of this that never made it into a courtroom? Let me know down in the comments. I read every single one of them. And if stories like this one are your thing, there's a new case waiting every week. Subscribing means you never have to go looking for it.